The main point is normalizing the relationships with Russia and try to bring it again in the Western fold. If this means sacrificing Ukraine, well, so be it. The war in Ukraine will end soon, but we will have another one in the Western Pacific. Hi, welcome. This is another Stick to Planes video in which I stray away from aerospace to discuss something which is in the news, and it is very important for the situation of the war in Ukraine. And to be honest, it is also very important for the geopolitical equilibria in the world. I'm obviously talking about the posture of the American administration, of the Trump administration, that seems to have shattered many rules of the geopolitical world, many configurations of the international political scene, so they can't really be ignored anymore. I will get back to planes, don't worry, but I have been asked by several people, directly by email or by patrons, to cover what is happening in the world and its relationship with the war in Ukraine. So, yeah, here I am. Happening that brings the German foreign minister to tears.
Let me conclude, and this becomes difficult.
That makes so many European powers convening in Paris for an unscheduled summit to take important security decisions, that makes Zelensky saying that he could resign if Ukraine was admitted to NATO. But there is a question overhanging all of this. Was Ukraine betrayed? In this video, I will present a couple of caveats, first of all, but then I will give a quick summary of what has happened. I will outline some interesting points. Then we will have a look at the perspective of Europe, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. Our purpose is to understand what is happening, and this means catching a glimpse of the underlying mechanism, of the underlying thinking that has brought to this apparent revolution. So, caveats, you may not believe it, but I've really no particular stake on one side or the other. This is the kind of video that in the comments will create a hailstorm from one side or the other. That's unfortunately the nature of the internet, it's the nature of YouTube. I wanted to point out that I have no specific stake. So I'm just trying to present facts and I'm trying to make inferences. If this sounds offensive to you, I'm very sorry, I don't know what to do about it. However, you may be interested to learn what I personally think. I don't know why you should be, but that's what some people keep asking me. So I have no problem saying that the Russians are aggressors and they are on the wrong side. If you shoot first, you are on the wrong side automatically. But on the flip side, I think that everything that stops people from dying is positive. It doesn't matter the side or the way or the means. Preserving human lives is much more important than anything else. Again, you may not agree, but this is what I think. So with that in mind, let's see what has happened. Well, there have been a number of events, we'll say international events, that are shaping the sort of earthquake we are living in. The first one was a speech of Pete Hegseth at a NATO summit in which said there will never be any United States armed forces in Ukraine fighting for the war in Ukraine, and any force deployed by a NATO country in Ukraine won't be covered by the so-called Article 5, which is a clause in the North Atlantic Treaty that says, basically it's more complex than this, but basically it says that an attack on one of the members is an attack to all the members, and the Article 5 is the article that may lead to military involvement of all the countries to repel this attack. He also said other stuff about the role that the Europeans should have, but yeah. The second event was the speech of the United States Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference, where he clearly stated that for Europe at least, the threat to security is not coming from Russia or China, but it is coming from internal policies of the European Union and internal politics of the European states. He was discussing immigration, freedom of speech, and so on. This was not received well by the Europeans. Several European leaders actually issued an impromptu rebuttal of the American positions, and The Guardian even said that that was the moment where the present world order has crumbled, which is a bit of an exaggeration, but it is surely very momentous. A third event was the phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. This was very important because it sort of marked the first official high-level contact between the United States and Russia since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, and it was a clear sign that something had changed. In the aftermath of this conversation, Trump has been accused of giving up Ukraine to the Russian interests. We will discuss this later, but surely it made waves at international level. And the other important event was the meeting in Riyadh between a US delegation guided by Marco Rubio, who is the US Secretary of State, basically the foreign minister, and the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Apparently, this was a relatively friendly meeting where various ideas have been floated, various principles have been established to start normalizing the relationships between Russia and United States. This wasn't about the war in Ukraine, or it wasn't only about the war in Ukraine. That was one of the points that they have touched, and they consider it a very important point. But I think that the most important element is start discussing potential areas of cooperation between the United States and Russia after the situation in Ukraine has been resolved. It seems that both sides are aiming for a full normalization of the relationships, and they seem genuinely keen to end the clash in Ukraine. In fact, Donald Trump, in a conversation with the press, pointed out that he's going to try to make peace with Russia on behalf of Ukraine.
I think they have to make peace. Their people are being killed, and I think they have to make peace.
Because he is believing that Ukrainians had 3 years to start a negotiation with the Russians, and they did not do it. To be honest, this is a very politically incorrect position, but that's the position that the US administration is taking. All these events are an earthquake of incredible proportions. After many years, during which the United States and NATO in general, Western Europe in general, Eastern Europe have antagonized Russia, now we have the most important player within NATO, within the Western world, trying to do the exact opposite, trying to become friendly with Russia. While being friends is obviously better than being enemies, I will explain later how I think that there is no real reason to be optimistic, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So, after all these events, what are the positions of the different parts? And Europeans in all this are running around like headless chickens, because something strange, really curious has happened when this political shift started to become apparent. So let's move on and let's discuss the position of Europe in this new world order that seems to be emerging. The first mistake that many do is thinking that Europe is a thing, is a sort of a political entity in itself. This is particularly difficult to understand by the American public. But actually, Europeans are not a single entity. The European Union exists, but it is an artificial construct where there are countries whose interest is different, and sometimes they have competing interests and they are sort of shoved artificially all together in an organization that tends to be a centralized straitjacket. In this context, though, what is important to understand about the European Union is that it was built with the consent, the help, the encouragement of the Americans, despite prominent figures in the American political discourse appear to be against this creation. And this has been demonstrated by the alignment that the European Union has demonstrated with the previous administration's position, that is a total, uncompromising, antagonizing position against Russia.
The Russian military, for example, cannibalizes by now refrigerators and washing machines to take out the semiconductors, trying to get the semiconductors for their military hardware.
Even at the cost of creating damages to the European economies. The reduction of Russian commodity imports, natural gas, oil, electrical power, fertilizers, cereals, has had a role in the inflation, the relatively high inflation that has hit the European countries in the last few years. When I go back to Italy, I am flabbergasted by the cost of food at the supermarket. I still have a house in Italy, and the cost of the energy bills is unprecedented in my memory. European aid to Ukraine has been very important. The help in terms of military supply has been prominently shown in the media, but it hasn't been particularly massive. But overall, Europe has provided mostly old systems, decommissioned stuff. There has been a number of high-profile European weapons that have been provided to Ukraine, for example, the Storm Shadow or the Leopard tanks, or some artillery like the PZH-2000 from Germany and the César from France. These have been featured very prominently in the media, but their numbers was somewhat limited. But this doesn't mean that the role of Europe is not really important, because a lot of financial help came from Europe. Sure, it came in the form of loans, so I don't know what's going to happen to Ukraine when this war is over, but that money was extremely important to keep the government going, to keep the country going. Moreover, a lot of humanitarian help entered Ukraine from Europe and was provided from Europe. I personally know people who, a few weeks after the beginning of the war, they personally just loaded a van with supplies, daily essentials, and they drove all the way from the United Kingdom to the Polish border to just distribute these. People who do things like this deserve only praise. Anyway, there is an Italian expression that says being more royalist than the king, which means actually supporting and affiliating with someone or something to ridiculous length. And it seems what is happening in Europe. As I was saying before, Europe, the European Union, but also many of the member states of the European Union, not all of them, but many of the states being part of the European Union, have been adamant that Russia had to be defeated and the war could not end in a military defeat of Ukraine. This was also the position of the Biden administration, but when this changed with the Trump administration, most of the European leaders have been thrown out of balance. The French President Emmanuel Macron called for a summit of the main European countries in Paris, where apparently the idea was to understand how Europe could support Ukraine in case the American help was interrupted. from one side, and from the other side, they thought how they could support peace deal in Ukraine. French and British idea was to deploy some European peacekeepers between the two sides after a ceasefire, and it actually didn't go well. Apparently, this is not confirmed, but the Germans just went away. The Italians more or less didn't care, so nothing really came out of it. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that Hegseth said is that no NATO force, no force under the NATO banner will ever be deployed in Ukraine. If the European countries want to deploy troops in Ukraine, that won't be covered by the NATO alliance. Actually, this should be a shared decision, but the United States have enough influence, and the rules within NATO are such that if they are against, it's not going to happen. Moreover, the Russians have made clear that they don't want any ground force or any air force, for what matters, in Ukraine, because they will be considered combat forces and they will be attacked. So this whole peacekeeping force matter is basically a non-starter. But there is another problem. At the moment, Europe doesn't have the industrial capability of keeping up of the requirement of a large-scale war characterized by large-scale operations like the war in Ukraine. Europe indeed has a defense industry, but it is geared for a peace setting. Understandably, many European countries have never seen a large-scale operation since World War II, but this is obviously of no help to Ukraine. And this very fact that we don't have the military capabilities of intervening in Ukraine, either extant to support Ukraine or to be peacekeepers or to set up a production line of anything the Ukrainians may need to fight the war, basically means that we Europeans are condemned to have relatively little relevance during the operations. We might become much more important when it will be time for reconstruction, but for now, we are on the sidelines. And in fact, that's what the United States did. Europe was not invited in Riyadh, and Ukraine was not invited, but for a different reason. Part of it is the fact that it was largely a bilateral meeting between the United States and Russia, mediated by Saudi Arabia, but mostly, and probably correctly so, Europe is not seen as a player that can have real influence in these negotiations. Hence, we are out. Russia, despite what some may say, has a few very clear objectives. The first is to have a buffer zone with NATO in Ukraine. The second is to consolidate the acquisition of the 4 oblasts of eastern and southern Ukraine plus Crimea as parts of the Russian Federation. This probably wasn't in the initial plan, but they sort of cornered themselves into that, trying to escalate the stakes related to the special military operation, as they call it. These are the two non-negotiable Russian objectives. We in the West often misread Russia because you can't analyze Russia with the same categories that you would use for a Western country. And to be honest, every country has its own peculiarities. You cannot use the same categories, the same models to analyze every country. Beyond the economic indicators, beyond the assessment of military strength, beyond the political analysis, it is important to understand the peculiarities of every specific country if you really want to understand what is going on. What may seem obvious and reasonable for a French is not necessarily obvious and reasonable for a Russian. Not necessarily worse, not necessarily dangerous. I met many Russians in my professional life before YouTube, and they were great people, but surely different. And in some cases, the Russians are different. And the Russia that we see today is largely the product of that historical process that started at the end of the 80s, brought to the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, the fragmentation, and the terrible 90s. When it was clear that communism was failing in many different ways, the Russians were ready to exchange communism for affluence. In the early 90s, the Russians were keen to become Western up to a point, to be integrated in the West, and become wealthy, to improve their quality of life. They thought that opening up the market and becoming democratic was enough to cancel the problems that were associated with the Soviet Unions. Well, as we all know, it didn't happen. The 90s for Russia have been a terrible time of great poverty. The social order was unsettled, and those years left a deep scar, a deep impression in the lives of all those who were alive at the time. This had two consequences. One was the disillusion of many Russians with the West. The second was the rise of a fixer. And Vladimir Putin was considered the fixer. This is the reason why Vladimir Putin remains so popular in Russia. He is seen as the leader who brought to an end this time of great national distress and put Russia on a development path. At first, it was a path that was moving toward a larger and stricter integration with the West, but then something happened. And by the way, I am in no way, shape, or form an admirer of Vladimir Putin. I think that government, don't let me speak, okay? What changed the posture of Russia was the NATO expansion toward the east and the importance that some Western influences were having on the Russian society. Even if NATO was not a real threat to Russia, that was perceived as such by the Russians because of their history and their national character. History has taught them otherwise. Then there was the famous Putin's speech in 2008 at Munich, and then the problems in Ukraine started. What Russia considered an acceptable solution in the context of the NATO expansion was having Belarus and Ukraine as buffer states on its western border. While Belarus is still a buffer state, Ukraine after 2014 became something different. And that is the beginning of the process that brought us where we are today. If you add that the famous Minsk agreements were not honored by Ukraine and the Europeans, and by the way, we have proof that the Minsk agreement were not going to be implemented. Very senior Western politicians explicitly said that since the beginning they believed that the Minsk agreements were only a way to gain some time for Ukraine to rearm and become more impervious to a Russian invasion. Well, that brought Russia to the decision of resorting to military force to re-establish this buffer state, this buffer zone against NATO. And from the other side, Russia is fed up with the West. That's the reason why they pivoted toward China. However, you must understand that Putin in Russia is seen as a moderate figure. Putin has extremists on his left, in the sense that in Russia the Communist Party still exists. There are still communist representatives in the Duma, in the Russian parliament. And on the right side, there is an extreme right which believes that, well, Russia has been too kind with its neighbors. So Russia United, Putin's party, and Putin's circle is sort of still the best hope for Russia and for the West to come to a negotiated settlement of the war. I have seen many people saying that the buffer state argument is moot, is just a deception, because, for example, the Russians did not really object to the NATO expansion to the Baltics. Well, that happened when the Russians could not object. They didn't have the either soft or hard power to do anything. And in any case, the Baltics are less important because they're more or less indefensible. it is extremely unlikely that a Western offensive, a large-scale offensive, could start from those lands. And they would be also relatively easy to invade because they are a narrow strip of land against the sea. And it would be relatively easy to cut the Suwalki Gap and isolate them from mainland Europe. So Belarus and Ukraine are way more important in Russian perception. I'm not entirely sure of what they are thinking about Finland joining NATO. Surely they are reacting militarily in the sense there is a build-up of forces with a defensive posture, in this case around Leningrad and in the Kola Peninsula, which are traditionally areas where a lot of Russian military power is concentrated. But for the moment, everything is quiet on that area. The other important element to notice is the Russian economy and its impact on the Russian military. I have seen plenty of analysts in the West predicting the fall of Russia under the sanctions pressure, and that didn't happen. And then the same analysis kept going. They said, okay, just wait a bit more, just wait a bit more, just wait a bit more. So the collapse of the Russian economy is always behind the corner. Honestly, this is wishful thinking. It happens the same with China, whose collapse is always weeks away and it never happens. Now, this is not the same as saying that there are no problems in Russia, because it's not the case, but the Russian governance of economy has shown a remarkable understanding of the key elements that keep an economy going and make it strong enough. A detailed analysis of the Russian economy will probably require a video twice as long as this one. But there are a few elements that are worth discussing. And probably the most important is to recognize that the Russians have replied to the necessity of the war economy with the most classic of all the possible replies. This is perfect textbook economy. They set up a Keynesian stimulus of the economy. The state is investing, creating money. And this was so effective that unemployment in Russia is now basically zero. The Russians are becoming richer. Well, the military is receiving very important bonuses. I mean, it's quite economically convenient being part of the Russian military today because the salaries are extremely good. Obviously, this has been done to incentivize the Russian people to join. But also the civilian population, all those who remain in the civilian life, are getting a lot of advantages. First, because the government has set up a number of schemes to support the families, particularly if a member of the family is in the military, but also in general, which is actually helping with the social cohesion of the country, but also the average worker. The average people who work in a company and have salaries are benefiting by the fact that there is almost no unemployment, that jobs now are readily available in Russia. And now that unemployment is zero, obviously inflation is rising a bit, and obviously the Russian central bank is raising interest rates to control the inflation. It is a problem, but it is controllable. Because inflation under a Keynesian stimulus happens when the production factors are fully utilized, that is, when unemployment is very low and all the factories are running at full speed. So it was supposed to happen. But the Russians are also investing in creating new production facilities. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence that within the military-industrial complex, they're building up entirely new factories, entirely new lines of production. For example, UAC, which is the conglomerate that contains all the aerospace activities of the Russian Federation, or most of them, is actually spinning up new factories, new production lines. They're going to take time, but it's happening. And fact a little known, Russia is a country that has a very large percentage of immigrants. Immigration in Russia comes from the countries of the ex-Soviet Union, and particularly from Central Asia. And there is a flow of people from Central Asia that are attracted by the good salaries that you can now earn in Russia. I wouldn't be surprised that at some point there will be some agreement, for example, with India to bring in Indian engineers in a systematic way to fill up all these positions that currently the Russian companies have problems filling. Russia has a technology problem, particularly for semiconductors, but also in other few areas. They don't have the technology that is required to build the most advanced weapons, but China is stepping up. They are largely compensating this gap. And now China and Russia are mostly trading in their own local currencies. They don't go through the dollar. Russia exports oil to China. They get renminbis, and the same renminbis are spent to acquire technology and other supplies from China. So despite the problems, the Russian economy is not on the verge of collapse. They did an excellent job. And please notice, it is not a war economy, not by any means. It is still a civilian economy. So it is clear that Ukraine is the focus. So what about Ukraine? Well, Ukraine in all of this drew the short straw. When Ukraine became independent, neutrality was a part of the Ukrainian constitution. This was overturned in 2014 after Euromaidan, when a Western alignment indeed became part of the constitution. So it was an important change of politics. And the Ukrainian ruling class started looking for growing integration with the West and membership in NATO and the European Union. And as I said before, the expansion of NATO to Ukraine was a red line for the Russians. Again, you don't have to agree with the Russians, but this is what they perceived. And you can't wave it off simply saying, okay, it's not justified, that they don't care, because they will react anyway. May not be right, but that's how the world is working. Anyway, coming back to Ukraine. Ukraine fought incredibly bravely against the Russians. They were extremely good at fending off the Russian invasion in 2022, in February 2022. They managed to get some successes shortly after with the offensives in Kherson and near Kharkiv. But after the failure of the summer offensive of 2023, Ukraine has been on a downward spiral. There is Ukrainian diaspora. The country is in ruins, well, at least the eastern part. A lot of the male population is either dead, wounded, or tied in the military, pretty much cratering the Ukrainian economy. The key production facilities in Ukraine have been destroyed by the Russians. So the long technological tradition of the Ukrainians has been reduced to rubble by the Russian long-range attacks. Currently, Ukraine is in a nightmare. And even if the war stops, the post-war will be a nightmare because it will be a country that will be in need of reconstruction, which means that Western corporations, Western companies will invest in Ukraine, but they will also want a financial return that will drain resources from Ukraine. Moreover, they contracted an immense amount of debt for this war that is clearly impossible to repay, but it could potentially keep the country down on its knees for decades. And normally, in Europe, when there is this kind of economic hardship, the door is open for non-democratic governments, for totalitarian governments. It has happened in the past. It tends to happen every time there is an economic downfall. Economy is not the only reason, but it is a very important reason why the far right tend to emerge in the political landscape. Anyway, if we look at the situation on the ground, it is quite clear that if the American help stops, the days of Ukraine are numbered. Even if the Europeans do not align with the Americans and they keep supporting unwavering Ukrainians, there are some capabilities that only the Americans have. I am talking about intelligence and electronic warfare. And the American, in general, Western intelligence apparatus has been a fundamental ingredient of the Ukrainian resistance so far. I discussed this several times. The reason why the war in Ukraine is moving so slowly is because the battlefield has become transparent. Every big concentration of mass vehicles, supplies, artillery, and so on becomes a high-paying target that can be hit by long-range weapons because it is spotted by a large range of intelligence systems that go from drones on the battlefield, commercial drones even, on the battlefield, to medium altitude drones, to electronic reconnaissance by aircraft, maybe on the Black Sea or outside of the borders, and chiefly the American space-based intelligence capability, which is top-notch, and is keeping the Ukrainian informed of everything is happening. If that vital pipeline is interrupted, then the battlefield from the side of the Ukrainians starts becoming a bit more opaque, and the Russians will have more freedom of movement. So far in the Ukrainian war, you have seen movement, you have seen dynamic operations only when the density of the forces involved was very low, and there were no systems available capable of hitting the concentration of forces. Otherwise, everything above the platoon level is hit so hard that is not worth it. The Ukrainians had an artillery shell crisis in large part of 2024, but now they are receiving enough rounds to maintain a level of fire that is capable of destroying these force concentrations. They have become very proficient with drones, and they still have some high-end systems like the HIMARS, the small diameter bombs, the ATACMS, the Storm Shadow, to attack high-paying targets. Take away the American support, and many of these capabilities will go away. To fire the HIMARS, to fire the ATACMS, you need the support of the American intelligence. Otherwise, you won't know where the targets are. You are reduced to attacking some fixed targets that you know where they are. You can attack a bridge, but you will never be capable of attacking, for example, an ammunition depot, because those can be moved around. And the other key element that rests mostly on the Americans is electronic warfare. Because the Americans have this comprehensive knowledge of the electronic signatures and the electronic order of battle of the Russians, and they can build it with exactly their reconnaissance systems, with their drones, their electronic reconnaissance aircraft. Apparently, they also flew F-35s without entering in Ukrainian airspace, using their intelligence collection capabilities and validating the concept and testing them, and apparently they are quite happy with what they have got. All of this will cease if the Americans go. Europe can keep Ukraine on life support for a while, but I believe that absent American support, the days of Ukraine are numbered. We are probably talking months before a large part of the front line will collapse, and the Russians will be, at that point, in the position of executing a big arrow offensive. Some have explicitly said, particularly in Ukraine, but also in Europe, that this is just a betrayal of Ukraine. I understand why they say so. I don't think that a category like betrayal applies to international politics. It is an okay term to describe eventually what is happening, but I don't think that it is useful to attach an ethical judgment to that. And this brings us to analyzing the remaining stakeholder on this subject, that is, the United States. So, what is happening in the United States? Well, Trump has been described to be impulsive and irrational by many, but I don't believe this is the case. I believe that there is a clear strategic plan that is being enacted. I will tell you the what, the how, and the why, obviously, in my opinion. So the United States are a global superpower. They have a global reach. This is a legacy of the 90s. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was no opponent, there was no contrasting force anymore. So they expanded their influence in the world. And I don't blame them one bit. The very definition of power is a country that has power, soft or hard, to influence other countries for its own benefit. This is what great powers do. China, Russia, India are all doing the same, albeit on a much smaller scale. I don't like it, but this is how the world is working. So the fact that we may not like it is really of no relevance. There's always a narrative that is built to justify this behavior, but at the end of the day, it is just that, a narrative. A narrative that shows how ethically and morally the power has the right of doing what it's doing. This is important to maintain consensus for the policies, but it is irrelevant to understand the purpose, the aims, and try to predict what is going to happen. Because obviously you need to understand which are the objectives to understand what is going to happen. I personally think that the American objective hasn't changed at all with the new administration. The underlying idea is always to maintain the American supremacy, loosely, but I mean the key element is maintaining economic control over all the economic areas that matter in the world. And this can be done not necessarily with hard power, but simply with financial means, economic means, commercial agreements, and so on. It seems that the new administration now is recognizing the fact that we are moving toward a multipolar world where there is no longer just one single power, but there are many. I am not entirely convinced that this is the case, though, and I will explain you why in a minute. In fact, before, I want to point out that it is not necessary that things are like this. There are cases in history, few, I admit, but there are cases in history where potentially powerful countries did not mess too much with their neighbors. So this level of influence is what happens in the majority of cases, so you can't really fault any country if they do to the extent of their possibilities, but it is not necessary. To avoid that, it requires very particular conditions that go beyond the economics, beyond the power, beyond the geopolitical considerations. It goes more into national character, national philosophies, and so on. But this is an exception, it is not the rule. I would love if we found a way of making it the rule, but I have no answer with that. So in my opinion, what is at the core of the American foreign politics now is the necessity of fixing a strategic error that the United States made probably 20, 25 years ago, in the late 90s, I would say. This strategic error was pushing Russia and China together. This could potentially be forgivable in the 90s when the rise of China wasn't so clear, but now it is blatant that a de facto alliance between Russia and China creates a power bloc that can antagonize the United States at a global level, if they wanted to do so, which I'm not sure they want, but obviously you have to plan for the worst. But the key problem is that an enormous slice of the world economy and of the world resources is now outside, well beyond the reach of the Western economic power. In China, the Chinese rule. In Russia, the Russians rule. In the rest of the world, the Americans don't always rule, but they have a very heavy influence. And this is difficult to accept for a capitalism organized like the American capitalism. The necessity of trading, interacting, even expanding is connaturate with the economic model of the United States. I mean, after the World War II, they managed to make the dollar the world reserve currency, which gives them the possibility to run a trade deficit in perpetuity. And to run a trade deficit, you need places to import from. This is obviously an oversimplification. It is more complex than this. This mechanism is not intuitive to understand, but it has been explained by various economists from one side or the other. So, well, it's not difficult to learn more about it. And in fact, what the Trump administration is trying to do is not end the war in Ukraine. That would be an important PR success, but that's not the main point. The main point is normalizing the relationships with Russia and try to bring it again in the Western fold. If this means sacrificing Ukraine, well, so be it. I'm not saying that I agree, I'm not saying that I like this situation, but I'm just trying to describe what is happening. So, in this context, in this attempt to normalize the relationships, it may seem that the Trump administration is recognizing some sort of multipolar world, but it is actually just a tactical move to split two countries that have become closer and closer and closer because they had basically the same enemy. Well, enemy is probably too much, let's say the same antagonist. This is obviously not the only component of American foreign politics. They are also clearly pivoting to the Pacific. Apparently, the Secretary of Defense has the intention of cutting the American military expenses, but not evenly, in the sense that they're going to cut the expenses for Europe and other areas that are not perceived as strategically important to focus on the Western Pacific. And this is no good news. This means that they are probably thinking that there will be a war with China. This is something that the US military has been preparing for quite a long time now. I really don't understand how it is possible to think that a conventional war between two nuclear powers is going to stay conventional, particularly if one of the two ends up losing or losing badly against the other. I think it is incredibly dangerous for everyone, but this is what is happening. As I was saying before, China is also aggressive, so it is not without any justification, but China is aggressive locally, not globally. China is just trying to expand the soft power, the business ties. They are not trying, like the United States, to get control of the economies, co-opt the ruling classes, or export a civilization model like they tend to do. I don't think the Chinese want anyone to become communist. And I believe that all of this is coming true because finally the neocon establishment, which is still present in the Trump administration, has finally come to terms with the fact that it is impossible to do this operation of exporting the American culture in China because, the country is so different that is impervious to any real attempt of penetration. They may accept some superficial veneer or Western consumerism, for example, but that's it. They will always be politically, culturally different, and that's absolutely their right to do so. And since the longer the United States wait, the stronger China is getting. We all have seen the progress that they made in the last few years in terms of military technology and military capabilities. The more they wait, the worse it is. So if a war is going to happen, which is very likely, in my opinion, it's going to happen sooner than later. And the objective of the war won't be obviously invade China and establish an American military government over China. That's blatantly impossible. The objective will be pushing China back 20 years, 30 years. Destroying the Chinese military, destroying the Chinese infrastructures, destroying some key Chinese production and manufacturing and technology capabilities. So if you look at the current events from this perspective, you realize that the Trump administration hasn't abandoned the global ambitions at all. This is actually a posture that is aimed at recovering this kind of global superiority, global control. It's not really imperial, it's not hard control necessary. Most of it is soft power, is cultural power. Military force is not always the best way of achieving these results. But I don't think that the Trump administration has abandoned this objective. What we are seeing is just a clever plan to fix a mistake that has been done before and move on with a different plan. And now, quite incredibly, I have to say something good about Trump, but what Trump is doing makes 100% sense from the point of view of the United States. It is obviously detrimental for many others, but from the point of view of the United States, that's the right thing to do, most likely. I mean, it is still a plan. We are not sure that it's still going to unfold correctly, but I believe from the point of view of the United States, that's what they should do to guarantee their position, to guarantee their economy, to guarantee their security in general. So under this perspective, what I think is that the war in Ukraine will end soon, but we will have another one in the Western Pacific. I don't like this perspective at all. I so wish I were wrong, but this is where my observations are leading me. A very unpleasant reality. Okay, I probably rambled too much. Thank you very much for listening to this very strange video this far. And the usual big thank you to all those who are supporting the channel on Patreon or by being a member or on GoFundMe or by any of the other means available. You guys are fantastic. So if you like this video, please consider supporting the channel financially. But if you can't, and that's perfectly fine, just interact with the video, leave a comment, subscribe, hit like, hit the bell so you will be notified when a new video goes live. And I promise the next one will be about aircraft. We will go back to aircraft, which is the focus of this channel. Before ending, a big thank you to the sponsor of this video, World of Tanks. Play World of Tanks and get ready for a cache of amazing rewards. Download World of Tanks now. The link is in the description. So, this is it. Thank you very much for watching and see you next time.